Yeah, hi everybody. As Millie said, I'm Jill Evans. I am a user researcher at Opencast. Been here just under a year, so I think November will be my anniversary. And prior to digital consultancy, I've definitely had what you might call a sort of squiggly career, doing lots of different things, mostly in the research space. Some things nothing to do with research at all. So I've had lots of ups and downs over the years when it comes to workload, work-life balance, generally kind of how I'm feeling about my work at any given time. And so I was interested in this topic, and I previously gave a version of this presentation in our UCD community here at Opencast. And on the back of that, Millie very kindly invited me to come and talk about this again at Content Folks. So that's why I'm here. Oops. Really important thing to say before I start. Just want to mention, so this topic inevitably touches on sort of mental health, physical health, those sorts of things. I've done some research, being a researcher, but I am not an expert. I'm by no means any kind of expert or a doctor. So if you do kind of recognize yourself in any of the things that we're going to be talking about, just think about maybe discussing it with someone who actually is an expert. So we're going to talk about various things, but they are just things that I've found kind of by researching the topic. I just want to stress as well that this isn't going to be kind of a full overview or full account of burnout and the ways we can deal with it. It's more of a kind of starter for 10, just to kind of start the conversation or keep it going and really just have a discussion about it. And as you may have picked up on already, as I'm not an expert, there will be parts of this presentation where I'm reading things. I'm definitely going to read some excerpts taken from various sources written by people who are much more articulate than I am about these things. So I'll include those references at the end as well. And because of how my brain works, and to avoid getting myself all stressed out, I'm also reading from a script. So I'll be open and honest about that. So forgive me if I sound a bit robotic in places, or if I lose my place, just bear with me. So what I'm going to be going through today is what is burnout and why should we be talking about it, particularly in UCD? How do we recognize burnout in ourselves, in others? And what are some practical tips and resources for dealing with burnout? So it's really just trying to give people a few things that you can think about and kind of meaningfully go away and maybe do differently over the next week or, coming period of time. So what is burnout? So in 2019, burnout was recognized by the World Health Organization as an occupational phenomenon. So I was quite surprised that this was quite a recent recognition, because obviously this has been around for much longer than that. But it's really helpful, I think, with things like this to have that agreed definition, so we can use that to kind of frame discussions about burnout and get things moving in terms of talking about it. And I think as well, one of the lasting effects of the pandemic is that lots of research is now being conducted into this, into burnout rates and things like that. So it does feel like a very current conversation, and more people are having this conversation at work and maybe with friends and things like that. So definition of burnout is it's a state of physical and emotional exhaustion. It can occur when you experience long-term stress in your job, or when you have worked in a physically or emotionally draining role for a long time. And the key messages here, I think, are that it isn't either physical or emotional. It can be either, or it can be both. So it is a combination of things, and that burnout is when these feelings or symptoms, or however you want to think about them, are long term. And I think that's going to vary from person to person, and everyone has different levels of tolerance, or what you would consider to be long term. And really key is the recognition that work can be emotionally draining, and I think that feels quite recent, that we recognize that work can be very emotionally draining. And I think that's really important, particularly in the work that we do. It's also important to think about the fact that it's not just stress. I think stress is perhaps a term that we're more familiar with, and certainly a term that's been used over the years, but it's a pattern of things all adding up to a state that we can find ourselves in. So it can manifest in lots of different ways for different people. So there's lots of chat about this online at the moment, and it just goes to show that lots and lots of people are dealing with it. You know, when you start getting the memes and things like that, you know, I think it does show that it's sort of within people's consciousness. So it's important to remember whenever we do feel burned out that we aren't alone. So I think that's really the first thing I want to make sure really hits home, that if you are maybe feeling like this, and perhaps some of you are, you're not on your own. Lots of people feel this way day in, day out. So perhaps it is a conversation that we should be having more often. So, but it can be quite hard to talk about these things, and I think that's where we get things, you know, people using humor and things like that. It can be very difficult to talk about, and not everybody wants to as well, which is obviously fine. You know, if people don't want to talk about it with friends, colleagues, you know, that's absolutely fine. But it is okay to be vulnerable. It is okay to share how you're feeling if things are difficult, you know, whoever that might be with. You know, hopefully everybody's got someone that they can talk to. And likewise, I think within the appropriate boundaries, and that's the important part of what I'm about to say, we can look out for other people as well. So we can look out for our friends, for our colleagues. We can encourage other people to talk if they're struggling. There's obviously quite a fine balance between, you know, those things, and caring about others and noticing if they seem like they might be struggling and then overstepping. So I think that's something to do with caution, but I do think it's important to kind of look out for each other. So I'm not suggesting that anyone sort of intrudes on anybody else or anything like that, but I do think we have that kind of shared responsibility to look out for each other. You know, as an example, you might not want to directly ask somebody if they're okay. If you think that perhaps they're not, but you could see if they want to take a coffee break. And, you know, hopefully that would do you both some good. You could ask about their project, so they have the opportunity to ask for help if they need it, and things like that. So I think, and similarly, you know, if you are looking to reach out to somebody to talk, perhaps you could take those same steps so that it's not sort of a direct ask for help. So why is this so important in UCD? I think in particular, we are very susceptible to this, and it is a conversation that you do see happening a lot in the UCD space. So I tried to think about some of the reasons, and these are just things that I kind of thought of. I reflected on my own work and things that have maybe got on top of me in the past and things like that. So our meetings are often very visual. We have a lot of screen time. I think a lot of the time it's cameras on, or it's maybe focusing on you know, a Miro board or something like that, and it's a lot of intense focus. Our work is very fast paced as well, that's often quite high pressure. I think we've all been there with, you know, something that needs getting done in a sprint and there just doesn't feel like there's enough time. We have lots of context switching and multitasking, particularly for those of us who are consultants. I think, you know, going between clients and then maybe our internal responsibilities, that can sometimes be quite difficult, and moving from one thing to the other in itself can be quite emotionally draining. Government work can be quite emotionally distressing. You know, we're working on very real problems for people, and there's quite a lot of responsibility with that. But also, you know, there are things like vicarious trauma, particularly for people that are working on research. You know, listening to people's stories can be quite difficult, and that kind of goes with the next point, which is that we tend to have very high levels of empathy in this job. You know, in any UCD role, or indeed lots of other roles, high levels of empathy tend to mean that we kind of absorb things a little bit more. Maybe we take our work home with us a bit more. I think just balancing, similar to what I said about the context switching, I think kind of balancing our client identity and our employer identity, that can sometimes be quite difficult. You know, if you're working across project, then you've got internal things as well, just kind of making sure that you are talking to people and integrating with your team and things like that. That can be quite difficult. We often have to defend our work. I'm sure lots of people are nodding at that. You know, sometimes it is a challenge that we have to be particularly passionate about our work to defend it to people who are maybe a little bit skeptical of it. Our work increased with the pandemic, as did lots of other people's work. But I think, you know, in particular, there were a lot of challenges that needed solving very quickly. And we were all sort of at action stations throughout the pandemic and working very, very hard, as were lots of other people. And I think, you know, that's perhaps taken its toll for some people, that it's been very intensive for a long time. Those of us that work remotely, I do, you know, it definitely feels quite isolating at times. So I think that's something that can take its toll on you. And I think we're probably all guilty of being perfectionists as well. I know I am. And I know particularly for the designers amongst us, perfectionism can sometimes, we can place extra pressure on ourselves at times. So what does burnout actually look like? So we know why perhaps we're susceptible to it, but what does it actually look like? What do we mean when we talk about burnout? So the common signs of burnout are things like feeling tired, feeling drained, lethargic, drowsy, feelings of helplessness, feeling trapped or defeated, feeling detached or alone, having a cynical or negative outlook. So, getting into that negative mindset and then sort of being cynical about other things. Self-doubt, so that imposter syndrome can often creep up on us. Procrastinating and taking longer to get things done, which then of course means, if you're getting close to a deadline, that can cause more stress. And then generally feeling overwhelmed, which I think is maybe the one we most commonly associate with burnout. And it's very, very common. So 1 in 5 people feel unable to manage pressure and stress levels at work. And 23% of UK workers said that their workplace had a plan in place to spot the signs of chronic stress. So that shows that although I think a lot of workplaces do have something in place and do have things like employee assistance programs, that sort of thing, actually not too many people are actually aware of it. But there is increasing evidence of other signs and symptoms of burnout. So there are things that may not necessarily feel like that's what they're linked to, but actually, as we said before, it's a pattern of things. And sometimes these things can be part of that pattern. So things like blurred vision, brain fog and memory problems, poor concentration, using more negative language. So that kind of goes with that negative outlook and that cynicism. Intrusive thoughts, so again, that sort of imposter syndrome, but also other intrusive thoughts that maybe are negative about ourselves. And then physical things like stomach aches, headaches. And this one I thought was really interesting. There is evidence to suggest that you will get even more hungover from less alcohol. So it may affect your weekend as well. But it's a really individual thing. So I think that the important thing to remember is that it is a pattern, and you may have some of these symptoms if you're experiencing burnout. You may have all of them. You may only have 1 or 2, but the feelings are still valid, and I think there's still things to pay attention to. And it's really important to remember as well that a lot of these signs of burnout might not be visible at work. So, when we think about keeping an eye on other people and just seeing if our friends and our colleagues are okay, some people will really successfully kind of stay afloat at work and they'll manage that day to day and they'll seem like they're absolutely fine, but it's their work-life balance that's suffering. They might then be going home and feeling very tired or very low mood. And likewise, burnout isn't always caused by work. Your job might not actually be the cause of it. So I think it's important not to think of it as too much of a separate thing in terms of your home life and your work life. You can feel very burnt out at home as well. And sometimes that can then exacerbate things at work, and it's quite cyclical. So it's all a balance, and kind of now more than ever, with people working mostly from home, as I said, those lines are very kind of blurred a lot of the time. Your work is your home a lot of the time. So when we're talking about what does burnout actually look like, much like many other kind of mental health issues, it's not always visible, but there are things that you can look out for, and there are things that you can do to try and remedy it if you are feeling this way. So I want to talk about kind of what we can do, because as I said, I'm not a doctor, and I also can't take away the things that might cause burnout, but what we can think about is, well, how do we deal with it? So if we can recognize those feelings in ourselves or in other people, what sorts of things can we do? So we know kind of roughly what it might look like, but we also know it's quite different for each person. We know that there are some common factors, but yes, it's going to manifest differently for different people. So what can we do about it, either when we feel it coming on, if we're in the midst of it, or, simply to try and be preventative about it? So hopefully it goes without saying that there isn't a magic wand. There's no one size fits all, but there are a lot of simple kind of thought exercises and things like that you can do to help kind of shift your mindset and start focusing on recovering or reducing the impact of burnout or stopping it happening. I will say a lot of this stuff is going to seem like stating the obvious, and that's okay, because sometimes having something that feels very obvious reflected back to us can help us realize we've been ignoring it. Being confronted with something that you think, oh yeah, well, that's obvious, but then you sort of think, no, but I'm not actually doing that. So there are loads and loads of strategies and techniques out there. So it really just depends on how you like to approach things, how you like to think about things. So it's quite personal for me, really. These are just things that I find helpful. They may or may not work for you, but I just wanted to share some kind of personal reflections and some easy exercises. Some of them are work specific, others are quite general life things, and I've tried to focus on things that are quite small. So pretty much anyone can do these things, even if you can only do it a little bit and maybe just make a start. There are lots and lots more sort of in-depth therapeutic approaches out there. Again, I am not a therapist, so I won't go through those. And also, I think, we haven't really got time to go through them, but there are lots of really, really great resources out there to kind of read through and find one that works for you. As I said as well, none of these are going to remove the things that cause the stress, because no one can really do that. But what they can do is potentially make the other things around that easier. So, they might help you to create headspace, energy, resilience to deal with the bigger stuff, rather than kind of letting it all get completely overwhelming. So one of the things I'll be drawing on a lot today is a project I worked on years and years ago. It must be probably 10 years ago now, at least, but it's always stuck with me. And it was a project with people who had survived a stroke, but they were left with significant mental health concerns and difficulty regulating their sort of energy and coping with day-to-day life. Now, that might not sound very similar to what we're talking about here, but although it was brought about by a very different situation, different set of circumstances, there are actually a lot of similarities in the experience those people had and what we see in terms of people having burnout. So I wanted to share some of the learnings from that project. And what the project was a 10-week program of solution-focused therapy. And that's why I think it's very transferable. Because it had lots of elements of sort of CBT, but it was mostly offering practical, measurable ways to think about making changes. So it was all about making those small changes to your day-to-day life, which might help manage the bigger stuff. So one of the things I learned about on this lifestyle intervention project was about ultradian rhythms. So I hadn't heard of these before. Maybe some of you have heard of them. But when we know even kind of the basics about it, it makes a lot of sense to try and get to know your own ultradian rhythms and work kind of with them, not against them. So this is one of the bits where I'm going to have to just read it, because if I try and summarize this, I'm not going to sound very clear. So ultradian rhythms, they're biological patterns. They're hardwired into your DNA. So they're a part of all of us. And they're a function of your clock genes, which dictate how your body functions. And all ultradian means is many times a day, and the rhythm refers to the oscillating sort of up and down wave patterns. So the primary purpose of ultradian rhythms is to manage your cycles of energy. So it's energy production, output, and recovery. And so we all have this, but it's a little bit different for everybody, but it sort of follows broadly the same pattern. And ultradian rhythms are sort of mini versions of your circadian rhythms, which probably a lot of you will have heard of. So your circadian rhythms are your sort of waking and sleeping cycle. And so these are just kind of little ones that happen throughout the day. Well, and they do happen throughout the night as well, that you can kind of pay attention to and then work with. So disruption to your ultradian rhythms can have quite a significant impact. So it can impact your alertness, your mood, your productivity. And even when your rhythms aren't disrupted, structuring your day around your understanding of your own peaks and troughs should have a positive impact. So even if you're not finding that you're sort of working against your rhythms in the first place, if you work with them, you'll hopefully see an improvement in those things. So as I said, the ultradian rhythms operate continually. So they do actually operate all day and all night. Probably notice them more while you're awake. So while you're sleeping, they're affecting things like your REM patterns, whether you're in deep sleep or only lightly sleeping. So you don't really notice them too much at night unless you're a bad sleeper like me. But during the day, they have a more sort of tangible impact on how you feel. So as you start your day, you get yourself into a flow of sustained activity. So however you like to start your day, maybe some of you go for a walk in the morning, maybe exercise in the morning. Others maybe tipping yourselves out of bed and going straight to work. That's fine too. I'll let you guess which group I fall into of that. So as you start to do that, your body and your brain start kind of burning through a significant amount of oxygen, glucose, and your energetic fuels. So within about an hour and a half, you kind of reach that peak, that apex of your productivity, and that's when you enter what's known as the ultradian performance peak. But while you're doing that, all of those kind of byproducts of all of that activity, so metabolic waste, snippets of data, cellular debris. Can you tell I'm reading this again? But they're all building up in your system. So after about an hour and a half, 2 hours, you start to need a rest. So you experience this kind of accumulation of all of this stuff. And the way we perceive that is stress and tiredness. So your productivity and your performance start to decline. And that's when you start to go into what's known as the ultradian trough. And it's as simple as that, really. It's a lot of science and it seems very complicated, but it's really, your energy goes up, your energy goes down again. So when you're in that trough, that's when you start feeling fatigued. You might get a bit spaced out, feel a bit sort of drowsy, a bit groggy, might get a bit irritable, might get a bit distracted, hungry, that sort of thing. So your attention is likely to wander from the task that you're doing. So that's when you might want to go to the loo, you might want to go and get a cup of tea, you might get a sudden craving for sugar or carbs or caffeine, whatever it is that sort of perks you up or that your body tends to want when you're feeling low. But you might also start sort of thinking, oh, but it's only mid-morning. Why am I feeling tired? What am I going to do? This is going to feel like a very long day. But actually, we're supposed to be doing that. Our body is supposed to be doing that. And fighting against it is what then makes us feel worse. So this is where the whole concept of the tea break comes from. In human nature, almost anywhere, we have this concept of, you work for a little while, you take a break, you work for a little while, you take a break, we have our lunch breaks and things like that. So whilst that might not have been based on people having a full understanding of the science of it, it is the same concept. So we all need breaks at certain times, and that's how we function at our best capacity. If you think about when you have a really well-timed cup of tea, or you go and get a glass of water or something like that, and then you feel much better, you've probably timed it very well for your troughs, and you go and top yourself up with whatever you need, and then you come back and you've got a lot more energy. But if you skip those breaks, it just puts you further into that sort of debt of needing those things, and you feel worse. So you feel more tired, you're going to feel more distracted, you're going to find it harder to do the tasks that you're doing. So feeling that tiredness and that slump is actually a really good thing, because that's your body telling you, okay, it's time for a break now, it's time to refuel and recharge. And that'll all be felt mentally and physically, but if you follow those signals as best you can, it's letting you know that you kind of need to be topped up, need to go and top your tank up with whatever it is that you need. So what we're going to end up with today is hopefully 4 things that you could go away and kind of have a think about and work with these things. So the first one, because now we know that breaks are important, but we also know that actually they can be very difficult to build into your day. I'm sure some of you were sitting there thinking, well, yeah, that's all very nice, but I don't have time for a break. But even just stepping away for a few minutes can really help us. So I'm going to challenge you all to go and review your diary. So think about how many back-to-back meetings have you got in a typical day? Do you have your lunch break in your diary as a standing meeting? Those sorts of things. So as I said, it might feel like it's quite unavoidable. I know lots of people will be on very busy projects. Maybe you're not the one putting those meetings in your diary, but is it really unavoidable, to have an entire day of back-to-back meetings? Could you maybe carve out some time for yourself, knowing that even sort of 5 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that will hopefully make you feel better if you can do it at the right time? So maybe think about where you're in a little bit more control of the meetings. Could they be 45 minutes instead of an hour? I think we're all guilty of just putting things in for blocks of half an hour or an hour. but maybe they could be 45 minutes or 15 minutes so that you've got a little bit of time. Maybe they could start 5 minutes past the hour instead of on the dot, to encourage everybody to go and get a cup of tea or something like that. Will any productivity be lost if you lose a few minutes in a meeting? I would argue probably not. So as I said, it's true that sometimes that packed diary is unavoidable. We all have busy days, but I think if every day is feeling that busy, then maybe it needs a review. It really should be the exception and not the rule. So I do encourage everyone to go and have a look and see if you can carve out some time, see if you can maybe pay some attention to your own peaks and troughs throughout a few days, and think about, okay, well, when do I tend to start getting tired? Maybe I can carve out some time there. And just think about how you can kind of normalize creating space for reflection and for rest and things like that, because even if your break is to just sit and reflect, that's also a way of topping your tank up. So you may find that other team members get on board because they want it as well. So the next one is keep up with the basics, and it's simple in concept but difficult to do. So drink some water, get some sleep. So yeah, not particularly simple to achieve, but it's very simple in that I think we all know that actually we need to hydrate and we need to sleep properly. Even really mild dehydration or sleep debt can have a huge effect on your body. You know, I'm definitely guilty of running on empty quite a lot of the time. This is something that I need to work on. But think about, when did you actually last go and refill your water? When did you last go and fill your bottle up or your glass or whatever? And this is one for me. What time did you actually go to bed last night? You know, are you getting as much sleep as you think you are? You know, when you go to bed, are you playing on your phone, or do you go straight to sleep? What are those kind of sleep habits looking like? Some people might be really good at that, but I'm definitely guilty of not being particularly good at that. So it's really easy to assume that the effects of these things aren't particularly significant, particularly if we compare it to other sources of stress, and it might be those other sources of stress that are keeping us up at night. But as I said, even really mild disruption can hugely increase things like anxiety. It can decrease our ability to think clearly. So if you're dehydrated or tired, think about how little you can concentrate on things. You know, you might have trouble articulating your thoughts, focusing on tasks, that sort of thing. So when we think about reacting to things that stress us out, actually chugging a load of water is a really easy thing that we can do if we're starting to feel that way. And I think that the harder one of these is getting to bed and getting some proper sleep, but they can make a huge difference if you can just get into really good habits with these, even if you can just make some really small improvements. But I think also by kind of bringing your attention to this mindfully and honestly. So yeah, being very honest with yourself about what you're actually achieving and what those patterns look like, but don't be hard on yourself. Just think, what can I do better? That's how you can take those steps to make improvements. And again, these are just a few little kind of tips. So yeah, to keep up with drinking enough water, there's lots of different ways that you can do that. So you can get bottles with times of the day marked on them. I find that quite motivational. So, you know, if you're not down to the 10 o'clock bit by 10 o'clock, you've got to drink it. Maybe fill a larger bottle at the start of the day, and just refill your glass from that. So know how much you want to drink throughout the day. Some people like using apps for these sorts of things. I definitely drink too much coffee, so I have to make myself get a glass of water every time I have a coffee as well. Coffee doesn't count, sadly. Drinking green tea as well, that's another way to, you know, if you can just drink a green tea, that's basically water. So yeah, and hydration pals. So I have friends that we will just text each other once in a while and just say, have you drank any water today? If not, go and drink some. And it is actually quite motivational. It sounds silly, but you know, all of these things, this is where we get to the, you know, I am stating the obvious quite a bit, I think. But like I said, it's easy to think that we're drinking enough water, but are we really? And it's really easy to kind of say, oh, I'm just not a good sleeper, but actually, are there things you can do just to make like little improvements here and there? You know, and if you try those, you might find that you feel a lot better. So yeah, on the sleep side, yeah, sorry, this one's just for the people from Opencast, but we did get some lovely sleep goodies recently, so hopefully people have been using those. But again, just look at kind of what helps you sleep better? So is it an eye mask? Is it, you know, blocking out the light? Is it a sad lamp to kind of maybe lull you to sleep and wake you up in the morning? Maybe reading before bed instead of scrolling your phone. Put the phone in another room if it's a big problem. Some people like having white noise on and find that gets them off to sleep. And I think also it's about looking at your waking schedule. So there's a lot of evidence to say that getting up and going outside within half an hour of waking up and just getting that natural sunlight, even if it's just for 5 or 10 minutes, that can actually kickstart your circadian rhythms and just get you feeling a little bit more alert and awake. So yeah, just to recap, I'm going to challenge you all to go away and just make 1 or 2 small changes to your waking and sleeping routine, or to try and drink the right amount of water for you, a little bit more in the day maybe. And you might be surprised at how effective this can be at helping you just with kind of energy levels. So again, it's that resilience to be able to deal with other things if you're feeling a little bit more alert, a little bit more awake, a bit more kind of nourished. And then just pay attention to how you feel each day and think, oh, is this, you know, perhaps when I've drank a little bit more water, I do feel better. We're basically all just kind of plants. If we have a bit of water, we usually perk up a little bit. It's not going to solve all of life's problems, but it might just give you a little bit more energy and clarity to deal with things. So the next point is I want everybody to think about what gives you joy. So what things are life-giving to you? So if you didn't have to do all the annoying, boring, stressful things we have to do in life, if you had bags of energy and tons of time, what would you spend your time doing? And what things are really important to you? And when you do them, you feel nourished. So, you know, maybe that's spending more time with family, maybe you'd read more, be creative, get outdoors, exercise, all of those sorts of things. And that's going to be different for everybody. But just take a second to think about what those things are that really are your kind of life-giving things. And then when was the last time you actually spent any time doing those? Now, I don't say that to be sort of critical or anything like that. Maybe people in the room are really, really good at making time for that stuff. But I think sometimes, a bit like with the water, we can think we're doing those things as often as we would like to. But actually, when we think about the balance of our day and how much time we're putting towards the things that really make us feel better, are we actually prioritizing those things, or do we feel like things are getting in the way of us doing them? So sometimes keeping track of that can be quite eye-opening. You know, sometimes people use habit trackers and things like that, and it can be quite eye-opening to kind of think, oh, actually, I'm not really doing those things as much as I would like to, or as much as I thought I was. And this is where, again, kind of small changes can actually make quite a big difference. So again, I'm stating the obvious, but sometimes somebody just needs to say it. So yeah, are you doing these things enough? And if not, what's getting in the way? And I don't mean that in a sort of rhetorical sense, you know, trying to be all motivational speakery, but what is actually getting in the way? What things are you doing instead that you'd rather not be doing? And can you reduce those things so that you can increase the things you actually want to be doing? So I'm going to reflect on some things that I have definitely said. These aren't excuses. They're perfectly legitimate things. You know, this isn't to make anyone feel bad about anything. It's things that people might say. Sorry, my phone's going off, so I'm going to move that. It's things that people might say, and these really are reasons that we're not doing things. And it can feel frustrating if you feel like you want to be doing something and you don't have time, or you know there are things getting in the way, because you know we'd all be doing all the stuff we want to do, wouldn't we, if we could. But life does get in the way, and as humans we can be quite sort of all or nothing about things, and I think we can tend to find it quite difficult to compromise, and we can be really hard on ourselves if we aren't doing something perfectly. So as I said, these are all things that I have said. I'm going to talk about some things that I tried to tell myself instead, with varying degrees of success. Not everything works, but as we know in UCD, we have to, in order to solve a problem, we have to fully understand it. So the first one, I don't have time to read like I used to. Well, that's a problematic statement in itself, because why do I have to do it like I used to? maybe I just want to read. So sometimes we get trapped in those negative feedback loops, and it's really, really hard to shake it off and just do the thing. Sometimes it's just a case of just doing the thing. And that's definitely something that I do. I get stuck in my own head about whether I am doing it right and things like that. So what I found is that I just try and tell myself that I'm literally just going to do 2 minutes of it. And I do this with exercise as well. If I can just go and do 2 minutes, that's better than nothing. And I can usually go and make it happen then. And obviously sometimes that then leads to doing it for a bit longer. But even if it doesn't, and I just give up after 2 minutes, I've still done 2 minutes of it. So I definitely approach that with reading. I definitely got out the habit of reading, and it was something that I wanted to get back into. So yeah, 5 minutes is better than no minutes. That's how I try and think about it. I also stopped being so ambitious with what I wanted to read, and I just read some books. I just picked up some fiction. It wasn't very good, but it got me back into reading, and that's okay. And we don't need to always think that we should be reading something, super highbrow or whatever. Sometimes just picking up a book, if that's the thing that we want to do, is the thing to do. Could give audiobooks a try. I didn't get on too well with those, so this is one of the things that didn't really work, but I gave it a try, and it's a way to approach it. And a tip someone gave me that I thought was really interesting was, if you're struggling to get back into reading, as an example, use your Netflix viewing as an idea to give you as a way to give you ideas for what you might want to read. So my reading interest had just kind of changed, and I didn't really realize that what I would find quite gripping was different to what I used to read. So I looked at the type of stuff I was watching on Netflix. It was all sort of murder mystery type stuff. So that's the books I read, and actually then I was much more able to kind of get back into it. So that was a really good tip, I thought. So I can't do something fun because the house is a mess. This is another one that's definitely said in our house a lot. I am also a very messy person, so the house is a mess a lot of the time. But sometimes it's worth just kind of asking some questions back to yourself about this and saying, well, could you just tidy the house another time? If there's a really lovely sunset outside or something like that, you can probably go and just enjoy that and not worry too much about what needs to be done. Is everyone doing their share? Maybe you just need to kind of have a look at how things are divided up. If the household stuff is feeling very overwhelming, maybe you look at, well, actually, who does what? So for example, my partner and I, there's certain jobs that I just always do, and there's certain ones that he just always does, because we each hate the other one. So why put yourself through doing that job, every couple of weeks or whatever, when you can just say, well, I'll do this thing and you do that thing, and it tends to work quite well. Why is the house a mess? Is it, are you already stressed and therefore you're just kind of walking around making a mess everywhere? Or is it something where whatever's creating the mess can be resolved differently? And yeah, can you do things differently? I mean, even things like, perhaps you're in a position where you can get a cleaner and things like that. Can you do things differently to say, well, this problem doesn't have to exist in the way that it currently exists? And also, sometimes with something like that, it's all right if your house is a mess. We also need to not place ourselves under too much pressure with things like that if we can avoid it. And I don't have time. That's another thing that I say a lot, definitely, when I'm thinking about why I haven't done something. But do you have time? Probably. You can probably make some a little bit like with the diary. You can look at, well, what am I doing with my time? I have my waking day. What am I doing with it? So for example, sometimes when I feel really stressed out, instead of going to the supermarket, we'll just do an online delivery. And that sounds like something so obvious, but it's the kind of thing that actually sometimes when you're very stressed, it doesn't spring to mind, and then you start getting stressed out about the fact you've got to go to the shop and things like that. So I think sometimes it's about looking at, again, can I do something differently? Can I just change things up a little bit to create that space, and take that task away from myself? Or essential versus less essential tasks. Sometimes you just need to reassess what actually needs doing. Is that something that actually needs doing today that's taking my time, or can I go and do the thing that's going to make me feel better? And so think about what time you have and just try and maybe optimize it a little bit. So I want to just finish this little segment talking about a slightly cheesy metaphor. I'm going to try and go through it quickly because I think I'm a little bit conscious of time. So another thing that we talked about on the lifestyle course was it was an old metaphor, and like I said, it is a little bit cheesy, but I do think it stands. I think the message is actually very helpful. So the idea is that we tend to take the same approach in our lives that we do with our suitcases on holiday. So even when we're already overwhelmed and filled to the brim, there's more we want to do. There's more we want to fit in there. So cram it in. That's the mantra. You just cram it in, try and fit things in everywhere. And that's when we start getting stressed because we don't have time. And then we feel bad about not spending long enough on things. So just cram it in somehow. So the story goes, there's a professor and he's looking at the jar of life. So he stands at the front of his classroom and he pulls out a large empty jar and he fills it with a number of large rocks. And he holds it up and he asks the students, is the jar full? And the students all say yes. So he pops it back down and then he gets a container of gravel and he pops it into the jar and the gravel goes in the spaces between the big rocks and he holds it up again and he asks the students, is it full now? So they're starting to kind of realize he's going somewhere with this and they sort of say, we're not sure. So then he says, okay then. So then he gets a container of sand and he dumps the sand into the jar. And it fills the remaining space between the gravel and the rocks. And then he says, okay, is the jar full now? And they all say yes. To which he then gets his mug of coffee, pours it in, the sand soaks it up, and everything has fit in. And he says, now the jar is full. So then he dumps everything out and he starts again. And this time he puts the sand in first. Then he puts the gravel in, and then he can't fit all the rocks in. So the jar fills up very quickly. He asks all the same questions, but actually he can't fit everything back in the jar. And so the cheesy metaphor is, but I do, as I said, I think the message is important. The jar represents your life and the big rocks symbolize what's truly essential in life. Those are the things that really matter, the things we were talking about previously that give you life. They're the reason we go to work. They're the reason we get up in the morning, you know, the things we really enjoy doing, the things that leave us with a nice full tank. The gravel is the stuff that's important, but it's maybe at a secondary level. So they're not the things that are super primary to us in life, but they are important. And the sand is all the stuff that you have to do in life, but it's not, you wouldn't do it if you didn't have to. It's not important to you. And they only fit in the jar if you put them in the right order. And I think that's the point, is that we have to make time for the important stuff. Otherwise, what's the point? You know, what's the point of going and being stressed at work and feeling burnt out and everything, and then not being able to enjoy your life? You know, it's just going to feel very hopeless. And I think that's when it can leave us with those feelings of hopelessness. So that's why it's really important to start with those big rocks first. So you structure your life as much as you can around doing those things. You know, maybe that it's you have a work life, you know, you choose a particular job so that you have a work-life balance to allow you to do the things you want to do. Maybe it's that you have working hours that suit what you want to do. Maybe it's that you get up really early in the morning because that's when you like to exercise and that's when you need to prioritize it. But whatever it is, it's about structuring your life and your day around those things that you really want to do. And that's how you'll then fit everything else in around that. So the third task I want to give everyone is to go away and just kind of have a think about that. Have a think about what your big rocks are. Do you feel connected to those things? Do you feel like you know what things give you life and give you energy and make you feel happy in life? Then go away and identify your gravel. What are those things that, you know, everybody has responsibilities that they have to do that maybe you'd rather not do or don't make you happy, but they have to be done. So you can go away and identify your gravel. And then go away and identify your sand. So it's things that are a part of life, but they aren't important to you. They just need to be done. So for me, that's definitely things like housework. I don't find it fulfilling necessarily, but it needs to be done. And I do feel better when it is done. Also things like budgeting, life admin, that sort of thing. It all has to be done, but it's not necessarily giving you joy. And then have a think about how your days are structured. So are you prioritizing those big rocks, and how might you do that differently if you sat down and kind of started with a clean slate and planned out your week? And then make it tangible, make it a thing. So for example, for me, I put things in my calendar that I know I definitely want to do, not so that I don't forget, you know, that I'm meeting so and so on a particular day, but even if it's go for a walk or something like that, I put it in my calendar. And the other thing you can do is use that to kind of make the sand tasks just easier to get on with, and kind of, you know, when you want to do them. So for example, on payday, I'll have a little calendar reminder to do all the little bits and pieces that need doing and sorting them out, so that it reminds me, I get it done on that day, I'm accountable, I can tick that that's done, and then it's done. And there's also a daily wins checklist that you can do, just to kind of look at, okay, well, what did I do today that actually, you know, really made me happy? And there's a link to that at the end. And the final thing then is checking in with yourself, and being honest about it and being mindful. So we've talked a lot about kind of things that you can do. Maybe some of you are already doing these things. Maybe some of you are going to go away and try them. But one of the really fundamental elements of the course that I've been reflecting on a lot is that we talked about what was different, not better or worse, just different. So it's reflecting week by week, day by day, whatever works for you, and taking that time just to reflect on whether you see things as improved or worsened. When you make changes, it's really important to reflect on whether they're working. Other things will change as well, things outside of your control. So it's really about kind of periodically checking in with yourself without prompting, without expectation, without making yourself feel bad if things maybe haven't improved. And then we talked about, well, why? So solution-focused questions and therapy help us to pinpoint even tiny changes which make a difference, so that you can do more of that and less of the things that don't help. So when someone had a better week, when we saw them, we really probed with questions as to what they had done differently. And sometimes it felt like they hadn't done anything any differently at all. And it got down to really small things, like they'd bumped into somebody that morning that they really enjoyed talking to, or, you know, they'd had time for a nice rest and a cuppa that day, and that had just made them feel better, and things like that. And they're really easy to miss if you're not being mindful about it and being intentional about it. So this focus on self-awareness can create those really healthy patterns of reflection, which when you practice them can then become habits and make improvements. So it also helps you objectively measure change. So I think particularly when things are bad, it can feel like everything is really awful all of the time. When we're in the middle of a very low mood, or if we're really tired or dehydrated, when things are feeling tough, it's really easy to feel like it's always been that way. But actually, if we measure change and however that works for you, you might look at it and say, actually, I do feel a bit better this week than I did last week, even though I still don't feel great. You know, we're not there yet, but I do feel better. Or if you feel worse, it's a chance for you to then reflect on, okay, well, is that because things outside of my control made me feel worse? Or were there things I might have done differently to make myself feel better? So, for example, if you're someone who's into journaling, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that the emotional decompression of writing things down is quite significant. But even if you're not, even just having, maybe, as I said, the habit tracker apps, things like that, or just being mindful, just checking in with yourself and thinking about it once a day, maybe meditating, that sort of thing, will help you to keep track of what's changing and how. So that's my last kind of practical tip, is just to kind of keep track of all of that. It's sort of the final piece of the puzzle, really. If you're going to do the other things, maybe just try keeping a bit of an eye on things, and then see what things you might want to do more of. As I said, you know, some things work, some things don't, but you have to try things out and then see whether they're actually working. So again, a lot of this is down to my personal experience and my own reflections. So some of the things I've done, as I said, I've created space for breaks in my diary. I'm quite protective of my lunch hour, for example, but I need it. I know that I need it. So I do put it in my diary, and I do try and go for a walk if I can. Eat the frog. This is a good one. Somebody taught me about this. If you've got a task you don't want to do, or it's stressing you out, particularly if it's only a little task, and sometimes they are the little ones that really get on top of us, do it first in the morning. That's the first thing you've got to do. Just do it before you can change your mind. Eat the frog. I don't really know where that's come from, but that's what people call it. There you go. I've definitely increased my water intake. I I definitely could do better though. So that's something I'm working on. I have decreased my coffee intake, which makes me sad, but it does make me feel better. So that in the afternoons I have green tea, and that does make me feel better. So I'm carrying on doing it, even though I love coffee. I have a little fidget toy. I don't have it on me at the moment, but yeah, that's helped me to concentrate in long meetings. So in terms of focus and things like that, that's something I've been able to do. I've started eating dinner earlier. I was terrible for eating really, really late at night, and then that doesn't help you sleep and things like that. Yeah, couch to 5K. I wrote this slide a while ago. That's not going great, but you know, I'm trying again at some point. I will try again. It's a goal. It's nice to have goals. As I said, reading, something that works really well for me. It might not for other people. I've deleted all the social media apps off my phone. I still look at them. I still go on the browser and look at them, but I've switched off all the alerts and everything like that, so that all the horrible news only gets to me if I want it to. So that's quite nice. And then conversely to that, yeah, I look at a lot of cute animals on the internet instead of things that stress me out. And I have had to stop listening to quite so many true crime podcasts. Yeah, just a little reminder that I'm not an expert. So this is a bit of a meandering set of thoughts based on some of my own experiences and some things that I've gone and researched. There is lots and lots of information out there. So a serious note to end on, if you are feeling burnt out and feeling like things are getting on top of you or anything like that, please seek some support. Either reach out to a friend or colleague and just have some informal support. You don't have to say how you're feeling, but just, you know, maybe just go for a coffee and have that nice social time and talk about something else. That might help. But therapy also exists for a reason. There's nothing wrong with getting help if you need it, and sometimes people do. So if you do find yourself at any kind of crisis point, please just make sure that you're seeking that help if you can, and do just keep a gentle eye on each other as well. That is it, I think. And then I think we can probably share the slide deck. So there are some resources on there, and all the sort of references for what I've looked at. So that's me, I think. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I've left a bit of time for questions and discussion and things.